Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboy Story, we ride the stories of the West Campfire, truths, trail, dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty, human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Rain touched Sangre Flats like a promise the sky could not keep. It came thin and rare, tapping the clay roofs, sliding down adobe, lifting the smell of wet dust and coal smoke. In the blacksmith shop, a lantern trembled on its hook. Jonah Hale bent over a rough plank table where a mescalero boy lay biting a leather strap. The needle flashed in and out, bright as a mesquite thorn tugging thread through flesh. Jonah counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The boy's ribs fluttered. Outside, a horse stamped in the mud. Farther off, wheels creaked and a bell rang thin as a nail on glass. Jonah nudged the wound closed and tied a final knot. His hands never shook during the stitch. They shook afterward. The hiss of rain turned into the old sound his mind knew too well. The rasp of a bone saw, men groaning through a mouthful of cloth, blood warm as soup against his wrists. Jonah blinked hard until the lantern steadied. He touched the boy's shoulder and spoke softly. "Go out the back. Ride with the man waiting." He pressed a wrapped packet into the boy's palm. Leaves for pain. 3 sips only. The boy nodded and slipped through the rear flap. Jonah lifted the floorboard and slid the tray of instruments under the shop next to a row of blue bottles and a journal that smelled faintly of smoke and carbolic. He pushed the plank back and stood. A hawker's voice bled through the rain. "Auction of prisoners. Justice by the square." Jonah set his hammer aside and stepped to the doorway. The street was a gutter of red water. People moved as if drawn by an old habit. He followed at a distance, hat pulled low shoulders, damp and gritty where coal dust met rain. The square huddled around a timber platform. A daguerreotypist angled his tripod cloth hood pulled over his head like a crow. On the platform stood a woman with her wrists bound. She did not lower her chin. The rope bit raw into her skin. She looked over the crowd as if choosing a horizon. "Naya Redbird," someone said, "mescalero medicine woman." "A drop of that tea and you never wake," a man laughed. Marshal Rowan Pike leaned in the shade of his office eve oilskin, dark as a bruise badge, bright. Water dripped from the brim of his hat along the line of his jaw. He watched as a preacher muttered as the auctioneer raised his arms and called out numbers like dice. 20 to start. 10, she is damaged. 5. The crowd pressed closer. Jonah stepped between 2 men smelling of whiskey and wet wool. He took out 2 silver dollars and set them on the plank table. The coins caught the cold light, a brief clear shine in the gray. 2, Jonah said. The square went quiet for a breath, then broke into laughter. $2 for a whole woman, someone hooted. The auctioneer stared. "Sir, you misunderstand the spirit of things. I am buying her freedom." Jonah climbed the steps. He took out a bone-handled knife and cut the rope from Naya's wrists. She rubbed the angry bands there and looked at him. Her eyes were dark iron, soft words, hard edges. Why, she asked. Only he heard it. "I owed better to people I could not save," he said. "You will regret this." "I probably will." Rowan's voice drifted across the wet boards. "Careful, Hale. Rattlesnakes bite the hand that feeds." "Then stop giving them reasons to bite," Jonah said. He took the coins back in his palm and left them on the table anyway. He stepped down with Naya beside him. The daguerreotypist's shutter clicked. A silver ghost caught the moment and hid it in a plate. A boy's cry split the square. Down by the irrigation ditch, a small body convulsed on the bank mud, streaking his cheeks. Evan, a woman, screamed, "Scorpion!" People rushed and then stopped uncertain. The boy's jaw worked, foam at the corners of his mouth. Jonah's foot lifted. The rain hissed louder. The bone saw leaned in from an old winter. Antietam the tent, the heat the stink. For a heartbeat, he could not move. Naya slid past him, already kneeling. She cut the boy's sleeve with a swift slice. One clean nick over the punctures. She put her mouth to the bite and spat in the mud. She twisted a strip from her skirt hem and wound a tourniquet above the wound. She looked up, eyes sharp, voice even. "Agave pulque, desert marigold, hurry." A man ran, then a girl, then 2. The daguerreotypist shuffled near and froze when Naya looked at him. He waited, hat in hands, as if he could change what would be held in silver. Naya crushed petals between her fingers with a cool splash of liquor. The paste turned the color of dirty butter. She smoothed it over the boy's skin and watched his pulse. Jonah knelt opposite her. He took the boy's wrist. He let his training climb up through the mud and the noise until it reached his hands. He counted. He watched the boy's ribs ease. He watched color find the boy's mouth again. The mother stumbled to her knees. "Bless you." She grabbed both of Naya's hands. Mud and tears mixed on her knuckles. Naya stood and faced Jonah. They were close enough to see the gray in his stubble, the scar through his eyebrow, the flecks of ash on his sleeves. "You stitch like a surgeon," she said. "I used to be something else. Devils wear white, too." Jonah nodded. He picked up the knife and wiped it on a rag. He did not tell her about a winter hospital. He did not tell her that his hands still woke in the night looking for thread. They walked back toward the shop. Naya would not cross the threshold. She sat on the bench under the eave water drying in her hair. Jonah set down a tin cup and a heel of bread near her boot. He went inside and placed tools on a shelf. He did not put them away under the floor. The forge settled back to its slow breathing. Coal glowed. The anvil held a ring of old hammer scars. Through the open door he could see Naya watching the street. She did not blink at the stairs. Behind her the square emptied. The daguerreotypist labored over his plate in the rain. Rowan walked across to his office with the cold-ground gait of a man who did not hurry for storms. Evening slid down. The smell in the shop changed, coal and wet dust and something cut with pitch. Jonah lifted his head. The rain had thinned to a mist. He wiped his hands and stepped out into the yard. Smoke unrolled from the shadow line where the stable joined the fence. Pale at first, then thicker. He tasted tar on the back of his tongue. He took 2 steps and felt a crunch under his boot. He looked down. An arrow lay in the mud. Its head was steel, forged too perfect, not flaked stone. The shaft bore a clumsy notch that pretended at a tribal mark, and got it wrong. Jonah picked it up and turned it in his fingers. The fletching smelled of coal smoke rather than sage. A horse screamed inside the stable. Fire licked under the eaves like a hand practicing its reach. Jonah dropped the arrow and ran for the bucket. Naya was already standing. The lantern light caught the wet on her cheeks and made it look like metal. He threw the first water and heard it turn to steam. The roof popped. Sparks jumped into the new night like seeds catching wind. The air bent with heat and pitch. Jonah grabbed the handle again. His skin tightened. The rain gave up. The fire took a full breath. Then it widened. The fire learned fast. It found the dry seam where board met beam and taught itself how to run. Jonah and Naya worked in a rhythm that did not ask for words. Bucket throw, hiss step. The horse inside pitched its weight against the stall door until the hinge bent like a soft nail. Heat pressed hard against their faces and turned breath into work. Neighbors gathered at the fence line and held their hats. A few muttered that the wind had been wrong all day. Most only watched. Rowan Pike stood on the boardwalk under his office eave and did not step into the rain. His badge shone. His eyes did not. When the latch gave, the horse burst through smoke and almost took Jonah with it. He caught the cheek strap with a glove and pulled the animal past the trough while Naya threw water along the doorway to keep flame from licking out. The horse trembled ribs, pumping sweat sharp as metal. Jonah put his hand on its neck and felt the wild hammer of its heart. He spoke nonsense until the hammer slowed. He went back for the last of the sparks. The roof had blackened into a crooked mouth. The bucket felt heavier every stare of that last run. The water fell and turned to white breath. The fire finally coughed and folded in on itself. Char hung in the air like a taste. Naya stood with a dark streak across one cheek hair plastered and eyes bright. She bent to the arrow Jonah had dropped and touched the shaft with her fingertip. It left a smudge on her skin the color of the forge. She smelled the feathers. She turned the steel head with her thumb and looked up at Jonah. She did not need to say it. This metal had met his coals first. He took it in his hand again. It was too clean to be made in camp, too exact to be cut by stone. The notches pretended at a mark from a people who never made their lines that way. It was a costume made by someone who did not care if the costume fooled the right eyes. Jonah walked into the shop. The air inside was warm and damp iron and ash and the ghost of pitch. He knelt and pried up the floorboard. The leather roll of instruments slid into his palm the way a gun knows its holster. He laid the tools out on the workbench without hiding them. He opened the long, narrow chest under the cot and took out a journal with the corner singed. He tore a strip of cloth, wiped soot from the cover, and put it back. Naya watched from the doorway. Water ran from the hem of her skirt and drew a dark line on the threshold. She looked from the tools to his face. That set of eyes meant he would not pretend. He banked the fire, packed a canvas sack, and tied a small bundle of food with twine. He lifted his medical bag and then set it down. He had no words for what that bag meant in this town now. The people in the square had seen a mescalero woman pull a boy back from a convulsion. The people at the fence had watched a building burn and practiced looking away. He faced Naya. They did not say we should leave. They did not say where. He nodded once and put the strap of the bag over his shoulder. She took the amulet that hung inside her blouse and tucked it under her collarbone. The small thing was carved from old bone smoothed by many hands. Jonah did not yet know its story. He knew the way her fingers closed over it before she stepped into the rain. They moved through the back alley where the puddles were clean and a stray dog watched with one ear up, past the tannery with its stink and the church with its shut door into the scrub that held a dozen paths out of Sangre Flats if you knew them. The arroyo opened like a mouth and took them in. Night in Las Morris Wash had a different smell. It carried wet rock and creosote and the green edge of something that hid in the ground until water came. The moon was a thin coin. Jonah kept the horse a half length behind and walked to keep the animal quiet. Sand whispered under their boots. The wash twisted, then widened, then pinched again between walls that shone with mica, as if the earth had its own faint stars. Naya led by starlight. She watched the bright one rise over the black spines of juniper and named it without ceremony. Morning Star, she said. Follow its shoulder and you walk toward water. Jonah listened to the sound of their steps and the way the wash echoed. He watched Naya count the dark stands of yucca and skirt what looked like shadow, but was a hole. When a coyote called, the sound bounced between the walls and came back thin. He thought of fever nights in tents where men mistook wind for voices and begged for their mothers. They made a dry camp in the lee of a split boulder. The horse cropped at a patch of mule grass with soft, steady noises. Naya built a low heat between stones with juniper twigs and shoveled a bit of embers from an old fire bed, careful to hide the glow when she had what she needed. She brewed something in a dented tin with a handful of dry leaves and a thin ribbon of resin scraped from a wound in a pine. She poured the tea into a cup and set it near Jonah. He lifted it, smelled a bitter that made his nose ache and a sweet wood underneath. For bad dreams, she said. He drank and felt warmth move across his chest like breath. He tried to think of words that would square what she had seen and what he had done. None of those words were fit for this wash and these stars. He slept and did not hear the saw. They moved at first light. The sky was a pale band over the canyon's lip. A hawk made a single sound and rode a spill of air toward the flats. They cut east toward a low ridge where a mesquite forest ended at a fence line that no one had walked in months. By noon they had reached the plain near Pine Gate. The settlement did not look like much from a distance. A few cabins pinned in a loose ring around a creek that did not brag about its water. 2 small fields of corn, a loom hung with sun-bleached cloth on one porch, a rope line with shirts. Smoke lifted simple and straight. Abigail Holloway kept a garden behind her house. The beans walked a trellis. The carrots grew in a shallow bed patched with straw. She had a bone-white apron and flour on her forearms, and she spoke without the extra words most people feel obliged to spend. "Come in," she said. "You look like the road tried to keep you." Inside, the air was warm from a cook stove and smelled like corn and coffee. A clock ticked with a sound like a small hammer on wood. A woman sat at the table, stringing charms made of feathers and beads onto lengths of leather. Her hair fell in a single dark braid across one shoulder. She lifted her eyes and held Naya's gaze with interest and without suspicion. "Starmore," Abigail said. "She and I keep each other honest." Star smiled. "Your hands remember more than they admit," she said, looking at Naya's fingers with their fine lines and the memory of paste pressed there. Then she glanced at Jonah and saw the way his shoulders carried a weight he was too polite to mention. Abigail set bread on the table and a jar of honey. After they ate, she set a letter on the wood and slid it toward Jonah. The paper was creased and soft edges rubbed thin from fingers that had read it over and over. "Lisbeth Pike wrote this to me 3 years back," Abigail said. "I sent flour to the garrison that winter, when the cough took half and spared half with no clear reason. She asked me to pray for her brother's soul. The words lost their edges long ago. The meaning did not. The letter spoke of a fever that had broken after an Apache man shared a remedy. It spoke of Rowan's fear that if a cure existed, it could be found codified, then owned. It asked someone who had a gentle reputation with both sides to talk sense to a man who did not listen well." Jonah folded the paper and felt how thin it was. He handed it back to Abigail and thanked her because there was nothing else to say. They rested that day. Naya walked the creek and named plants without speaking them out loud. Star showed her a shelf where a little glass held sprigs drying upside down. They compared scars on their forearms from brushes with cat's claw. Jonah stood in the yard for a long time and turned the arrowhead in his pocket without knowing he had taken it. At dusk, they left Pine Gate by the back path that followed the creek up a shallow bend, then dropped into open country. The heat went out of the day. Glass Knife Canyon cut the plain into a hard line that rose and fell, then rose again into pale cliffs. A line of tents and 2 low structures sat in the bottomland where the canyon widened. Lanterns bobbed along a fence at dusk. Jonah lay flat and watched ants move across his forearm. He breathed through his nose and counted. Guards walked the perimeter in pairs. They paused at the far corner and looked out at nothing for a count of 30 before they turned. The north side had brush to its edge and a narrow spill of rock that made a sound like wind when stepped on. The east side faced open ground and would kill anyone foolish enough to run across it. The south gate had a lantern that burned weak and guttered once out of every 6 breaths. Jonah marked the rhythm in his head. 30 on the long side, 15 at the gate, 30 again. He did not speak. He tapped once on Naya's wrist and pointed when a gap opened. She mapped it on her palm with her thumb, as if drawing a road that only she could see. They backed out with the same care they had come. The canyon walls bled sound away, but Jonah had learned not to trust quiet. They reached the edge of a stand of aspen where the white trunks caught the last gray light. A twig snapped in the wrong way. Riders moved among the trees without the usual noise. 6 of them, maybe more behind. Jonah did not count faces. He counted angles and looked for dirt that would hold a boot without telling on it. The first shot split a leaf. The horse reared. Jonah put his hand on the animal's neck and told it a lie. He fired twice low to slow the lead rider. He hit flesh once because the man swore and grabbed at his leg. Naya pulled him toward a shadow that was not a shadow. Basalt had poured and cooled long before there were men here to witness it. The cave mouth took them in and gave them a smell of old water and stone. A bat moved somewhere and then settled again. They crouched just inside where the light could not name them. Shots clattered down the stone and died. Bootsteps went past and came back. They waited. When the voices finally drifted away to the west, Jonah dared a breath that did not hurt. Naya lit a small pool of fire without letting the flames show at the mouth. She took a strip of cloth, tore it clean, and pressed it against Jonah's shoulder where a graze had darkened the shirt. The fabric bloomed. She reached to wipe away blood and paused. The scar on Jonah's upper arm was a brand left by fire. The letters had warped, but the shape was still clear to anyone who had learned what to look for on cold nights with bad company. A unit mark from a past that did not ask questions it did not want answered. Naya's fingers rested a moment above the scar. "You marched with men who burned our houses," she said. Her voice had no heat, it had weight. Jonah did not look away. For a time that was so long he had not measured it. I did not know what the march meant. Then I learned. I left with what I could carry. She cleaned the wound. From the pocket inside her dress, she took the bone amulet and set it in his palm. "Old Coyote gave it to my mother, and she gave it to me," she said. "Wear it where your fear can see it. It will not keep you from doing what you will do. It will help you look at it while you do it." He closed his fingers over the smooth bone. The heat from her hand stayed in the thing longer than it should have. They left the cave when the sky had gone from black to the color of lead. The aspen field whispered in a light wind. Dew made the grass along the wash glow when the first gray slid down from the ridge. Jonah cut back toward a cottonwood line where the ground held a softer print. Naya stopped so quickly that the horse almost stepped on her. A mark had been carved into the bark at shoulder height, not letters, not a picture. 3 notches set in a line and a 4th diagonal. A small crescent beside them, sap still bright on the edges. Naya touched it and read aloud in a voice so low that it sounded like a prayer. "Mother lives, child in the cage, follow the morning star." The creek ticked over stone. A bird called once. Jonah felt the world pull into a point that lived at the center of that tree. He looked up the line of the creek to where the sky opened. Naya lifted her face and set her jaw. The horse tossed its head as if the air had changed. The cottonwood leaves made a sound like soft clapping, then settled. The sky closed its fist around the light. Heat bled away, and the first cold drops found the dust and turned it to smell. Glass Knife Canyon waited ahead, a dark mouth lined with wet stone. Jonah put his palm on the horse's nose to quiet the huff and felt the tremor run through the animal. Naya watched the rim where clouds stacked like black cotton and said nothing. The cottonwoods along the wash twisted leaves showing the paler underside, a sign old people trusted more than any calendar. The storm came on a long breath. Wind laid the grass flat, then reversed it. Lightning showed the camp in a clean white flash, every line and angle cut sharp as bone. Fences, 2 low cabins, A bigger house with a narrow porch and a lamp in the front window. A squat stone building that held a cold in its walls even in summer. Men moving between each point like figures on a board, repeating paths until they no longer noticed they were repeating them. Then the dark fell again, and the rain followed it. Jonah counted the guard loop under his breath. 30 steps on the north, 15 on the south. The east side turned its face to open ground and dared anyone to cross it. The lantern at the gate fluttered and threatened to die. When it sagged, he touched Naya's wrist and felt her answer through her skin. He tugged the horse deeper into the brush and waited for the signal inside his head that felt like a door opening. They split without talk. Jonah took the low road, a line that hugged the fence where scrub grew and lay flat under rain. Naya moved along the wash, using shadow and a long habit of walking in it. The world narrowed to sound and count. Boot leather gave a soft kiss to wet dirt. A rifle strap creaked once. Rain drummed on the tin roof of the stable and turned each breath into a visible thing. At the gate, he stumbled into the light like a man who had lost his way and his sense. He let his hat hang by the chin cord and his hair plaster across his forehead. He put a hand to his ribs and bent as if the pain had leaned a knee into him. When he said the word ambush, he let it break in the middle. The nearest guard stepped forward, uncertain, caught between training and what a face can do when it is wet and pale. Jonah moved when the man did. He took the rifle at the halfway point where both hands rested out of habit. He turned the barrel down, touched the guard's throat with the edge of his hand, and guided him to the ground before the man knew whether to be angry or afraid. The second guard lifted his weapon and met Jonah's elbow at his jaw. The lantern swung, the light made a wheel on the mud, and then the wheel broke. He dragged the two men into the wet grass and found the ring of keys by feel more than sight. The lock took the key like a hungry thing. The gate gave a small cry and came open. Jonah slid inside and let it close without the latch catching. He kept to the long wall of the big house. Through the window he saw a map nailed crooked to a plank and a table with a ledger open to a list of names that were numbers. He moved past that hurt and reached the corner. The storm helped. It skinned sound off surfaces and threw it away. He made the porch in 3 steps and pressed his shoulder to the door. On the far side of the camp, Naya found the small cabin by the way the guard held himself. Not bored, not wide awake, a man who had not yet decided what he wanted his night to be. She broke a stick behind the rain barrel and let it snap. He turned with a grunt and went to look where the stick had not fallen. Naya went to the door and let herself in. Maeva sat in a chair beside a lamp turned low. She had braided her hair with sage for its smell rather than its luck. She did not startle when Naya came through. She lifted her chin, then stood and took her daughter's face in her hands. Their foreheads met and rested together for a breath. Then Maeva took in the room with a single cold glance and said, "Do not step on the dark in front of the threshold." Naya lifted the lamp and saw what the dark had hidden. Char spread like spilled paint, a line meant to show men where feet went when they tracked. She stepped wide of it and reached for the door. The guard had stepped farther than his orders had covered. She slipped behind him, touched the back of his knee with the side of her boot, and when he gave, she took his balance and the breath from his throat. She left him in the weeds with his hands bound by his own belt. Jonah did not knock. He did not kick the door. He hit the lock with the butt of a pistol and pushed when the wood agreed to give. The front room smelled like damp paper and lamp oil. A second door stood closed, and a voice came through it low and even with a sharp edge under the evenness. Rowan Pike stood over Talon in a room that had too much light for its size. Talon had blood in the corner of his mouth and his hands free. His fists were empty because a man who planned to fight with his hands does not carry things he will need to drop. Jonah's eyes cut to the corner where a small boy stood with one hand in the pocket of his shirt. Jesse's eyes, one blue and one brown, pulled the light without asking permission. Jonah felt heat crawl up the back of his neck and could not name its source. Rowan reached for his gun. Jonah had already lifted his. A breath dragged its teeth across the room, and then Isaiah Boone came in through the back and took in what he needed in half a second. He raised his hand and then froze when Rowan's other hand came out of his vest with a small silver pistol that had not yet learned to be quiet. The crack was flat and bright. Isaiah staggered as if a door had opened behind him, and then he put his hand to the blood that bloomed along his shoulder. Jonah fired without thinking about the math of it. The shot took Rowan high and turned him sideways. The marshal grabbed for the table to keep from falling. The ledger slid to the floor and opened its pages to the dirt. Talon crossed the room in 3 steps and lifted Jesse with one arm, then put his body where a bullet would likely travel. The boy did not cry. He put his head under his father's chin and watched through his hair. Rowan straightened and tried to lift the derringer again. His mouth went tight in a way that said the pain was the least of his concerns. Jonah held his aim and spoke in a voice that did not rise. Enough. It was not a word that had anything to do with mercy. It meant stop, or I put metal where your heartbeat lives. Rain hit the window with 1,000 small fingers. From outside, a 3-note whistle cut the storm and turned into shouts. Naya came through the kitchen with Maeva behind her, both faces bright with sweat and cold. Ruth, who had slipped free of the stone house when the guard looked the wrong way, arrived in the next breath with her hair stuck to her face and a split lip. Her words came out in a rasp. Talon is his. The boy is the marshal's blood. He knows. He saw the eyes. Rowan did not deny it. He was a man who had trapped himself inside a room with 4 people who did not owe him anything but their accuracy. He let go of the table and stood on his own, which said something about what he valued. Isaiah pressed cloth to his wound and gave Jonah a look that stood between 2 worlds. Jonah nodded once. They moved. There was no procession, just motion. Naya and Maeva toward the back. Ruth taking Jesse's small weight from Talon so he could put both hands into the work ahead. Jonah reversed to cover the doorway, then stepped forward with them because a man must either stand as a door or go through it. He chose the second. The yard had become a shallow creek. Mud drew a sound from each footfall. The storm ripped the sky open and put it back together before anyone could name what had been seen. A pine at the edge of the yard shivered. Lightning came down like a white rope. The tree exploded into wet fire that steam took in both hands and tried to smother. Men shouted without words. Rifles went off into the ground, and the air aimed at shapes that had already moved. The group broke cleanly without intending to. A burning limb fell and blocked the short way to the gate. Jonah saw Naya and Maeva go right along the fence line using shadow and steam. He saw Talon and Ruth carry the child left toward the stable where the roof had not yet given itself up. Isaiah leaned in the doorway and held himself upright with a jaw that had decided pain was a kind of weather and not a reason. Rowan stood alone in the center of the yard for the length of a slow blink. Rain hit his face and washed the blood down his sleeve. He turned his head and found Jesse across the smoke. For an instant, a kind of softness moved his mouth. Then the storm threw a new sheet of water at the scene and took the expression with it. A bugle called from the canyon road and made the night taste like brass. Men answered it by habit. The wind changed. Smoke leaned the other way. The ground underfoot went from slick to sheer as the clay gave up its grip. Jonah ran toward the nearest cover and felt the horse at his side without looking. He heard Naya's voice once low and sharp from the dark on the fence line. Then he did not hear it again because the storm ate the sound and kept it. They left the canyon under a sky that could not decide what to keep. The storm chased them across the flats until the rain thinned to a wet breath and the wind lost its claws. Jonah led the horse by the cheek strap. Naya and Maeva moved in a straight line through broken sage. Talon carried Jesse for a mile, then put the boy on his hip when the ground softened. Ruth kept to the shadow side of everyone, head-down curls, streaming water. They reached the old mining cabin after midnight. The place had collapsed on one side where snow had gnawed it in winters past. The remaining room still held a roof and a black stove with a cracked belly. The door stuck on a swollen board and then gave. Mice ran from a corner and lifted dust that smelled of canvas and coal. Jonah set the horse in a narrow pen behind the cabin and found a bucket under the eave. Naya made a low fire in the stove and kept the damper quiet. Warmth settled in with a fine impatience. Maeva coaxed a dry rag from a trunk and wrapped it around Jesse's shoulders. The boy leaned into her without speaking, eyes half closed but watchful. Talon stood at the window and watched the line of cottonwoods until the leaves became ordinary again. Isaiah Boone arrived last with his left arm tied against his ribs. He had followed their tracks and the way the brush bent back when a body pushed through it. He closed the door and breathed once like a man leaving a deep river. Ruth found a chipped basin and poured water. Blood turned pink in it. She lifted Isaiah's sleeve and clicked her tongue at the torn flesh. Maeva set a bundle on the table and opened it. Roots, bark, a pinch of something black that held the smell of old smoke. She worked without remarks. Ruth's hands learned the rhythm and matched it. Isaiah stayed upright through the stitches, and then sank back into the chair with care. Jonah drew lines in dust on the floor with the end of a stick. the line of the canyon, the fork in the wash, the cut where the trail turned to stone. He made dots where he had seen guards pause and where the lantern had guttered. He pushed the stick aside when he heard the horse huff and stamp twice, not fear, warning. A man stood in the clearing beyond the door, hat in his hand shirt, dark at the shoulder. He did not bring a horse into view. He did not shout. He did not lift his empty hand above his head as if surrender could be arranged. He waited until the door opened and then spoke as if he had been invited. "Rowan Pike." Jonah kept the pistol low along the doorframe. Talon took one step to put his body between the lawman and his son. Naya did not move from the stove. Maeva's eyes went to the bundle of herbs and then to the new cut across the night. Rowan looked at the pistol without interest. He looked at the faces and stopped on Jesse. The boy stared back, chin tucked. Rowan blinked and took that breath men take when they taste iron. He did not step forward. "I came to talk," he said, "not to take. If you lied to yourself, Maeva said the room will not hold you. Sit." He sat on a nail keg near the door. He did not ask for a clean rag. He did not reach for his shoulder. Naya passed Jonah the smallest nod. Jonah lowered the gun, but kept it in his hand. Maeva set a clay cup on the table. She crushed willow bark and osha root with the back of a spoon. She tore a thread of sage and added it to the mix with a little water. Steam rose. The smell was bitter and green. "Drink," she said, "then answer without story." Rowan took the cup and held it with both hands. The heat set a small tremor in the fingers that had held a pen all afternoon and a gun at dusk. He drank. The first swallow brought a tightness to his jaw. The second made his eyes shine. He finished it and set the cup down. When he spoke, his voice had lost the high note it took on when he argued with men in uniforms. "What do you fear?" Maeva asked. He looked at his hands and then at the boy again. "Losing blood I did not know I had," he said. He tried to say more, and the words broke apart. He waited and then spoke to the floor. "Losing my sister when I promised not to. Owning nothing that could bring her back, so I tried to own what almost had." "Where did you learn to turn fear into orders?" Maeva asked. "My father taught me to name shaking as a choice. He died proud. I mistook his pride for a map." Jonah said nothing. Isaiah watched Rowan with the still face of a man who had learned to judge a voice rather than the badge on a vest. Ruth's mouth flattened and then eased. "You thought medicine was a key to a locked door," Maeva said. "You tried to force the lock and broke the wood around it." Rowan nodded once. The nod cost him. Maeva stepped close and set her palm above the wound without pressing. Heat lived there. She moved her hand to the middle of his chest and held it there until he looked up. She removed her hand and went back to the table. "You will say what you have done and what you will not do again," she said. "You will say it where your boy can hear it." Rowan did not reach for permission. His face did not soften. He looked at Jesse and spoke in a plain voice that carried to the far wall. "I hunted your mother," he said. "I kept people who could teach me and called it law. I put men in rooms and took their names away." He paused, and his mouth tried to shape a defense. He did not give it shape. "No one has the right I took," he said. "I will not take it again." Horses moved in the timber below the cabin. Metal clicked against leather. The sound climbed the hill in small scuffs of hoof and breath. Talon stood up from the window with a look that did not ask a question. Jonah lifted the pistol again. Ruth put Jesse behind the stove. Isaiah pushed himself to his feet and checked his bandage with a short, impatient tug. Rowan stood. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and turned to Jonah. "Let me speak to them," he said. Jonah hesitated. He searched Rowan's eyes in the way surgeons look a patient over and decide where the line lies between cutting and leaving alone. He stepped aside. They went out into air that had not yet decided to be night or morning. 8 riders fanned into the clearing, their horses wet to the knee. Harkins led them on a big bay and let the bay speak first with a snort and a stamp. Men shifted in saddles and made room for what they thought would happen. Marshal Harkins called, "We are here for the fugitives. Word is, you are with them." Rowan stood in front of the door. The lantern Jonah had hung after they arrived made a small island of yellow on his shirt and a pale rim along his jaw. "There will be no arrests," Rowan said. He did not raise his voice. He did not put weight on the words that men usually lean on. "Stand down." Harkins rode a step forward. "Sir," he said. He tried to turn sir into a doubt. "Sir, have you been dosed?" Rowan let the question fall. He stepped toward Harkins until the bay could feel his breath. He reached up fast and took the bit not to hurt the horse, but to stop the half step that puts a hoof over a foot. Harkins pulled back a fraction. The whole line of riders felt that quarter inch. "You will release the prisoners in the canyon," Rowan said. "You will break camp. You will take orders from Isaiah Boone until such time as the county appoints a new marshal." He did not look back at Isaiah. He did not give him the nod a superior gives a subordinate when handing down a burden. He said it as a fact already completed. Laughter clicked around the line like buckles, one rider muttered. Another put 2 fingers to his hat brim and looked down the barrel of his own doubt. Boone Harkin said. He made the name a question because he did not know how else to hold it. Isaiah stepped to the edge of the lantern light. He did not make himself large. He did not shrink. He stood and let Harkins measure what a spine looks like when it is tired and still straight. Rowan took his hand from the bit and lifted it to shoulder height. He did not give a speech. He did not consider what the story would read like when someone retold it later. If you keep your weapons in your holsters, he said, you will go home tonight. If you do not, you will not. Harkins put both hands on the saddle horn. He turned his head as if the trees would pass him a better idea. When the trees stayed trees, he nodded. The men shifted again. Some let out the breath they had been holding so long it had grown old in their chests. One swung down and went to tighten a cinch because hands need a job when a mind is deciding. Rowan let the quiet settle. He stepped back. The 8 riders wheeled and headed down the slope with more noise than they had brought up. Harkins looked over his shoulder once. Not at Rowan, at Isaiah. Rowan did not move until the last hoofbeat fell apart among the rocks. He went back inside. The room moved him a notch to the left and then set him down. The smell of willow and sage still hung in the warm air. Maeva stood with one hand on the table. She did not smile. He looked at Jesse, then at Talon, a father and a son with too much time between them. Something other than grief crossed his face and left it. He faced Isaiah. You have the badge now, he said. I will write the letter that makes it real. He took the pin from his vest and set it on the table. The little star gave back a thin scrap of lantern light. He touched the spot on his shirt where the blood had made a dark map. Then he looked at Naya and at Jonah. Thank you, he said, not for the wound, for the room where a man could say a thing and not be shouted down by his own voice. From the valley below came a faint tapping. Not a hoof, not a hammer. Metal on metal in a pattern that did not belong to animals or weather. The telegraph in Sangre Flats spoke to someone in the county seat with fast little clicks that traveled like rain across wire. The stove ticked. The horse stamped once behind the cabin. The lantern's flame leaned when a draft slid under the door and then stood back up. A month thinned the mud and pulled the hills back into shape. Pine Gate breathed like a chest that had learned a slower rhythm. A ring of wickiups rose along the east meadow, their willow frames skin tight against the wind. The cabins along the creek kept their chimneys talking in the cool mornings. Children chased each other across the footbridge in a tangle of bare feet and laughter. The creek answered with its small, tireless song. Jonah's clinic took the light well. 2 tall windows faced the water. Shelves cut from cottonwood held glass jars with labels in 2 hands, his ink and Naya's charcoal. A clean table stood under an oilcloth. A basin rested on a stool. On the far wall, an anatomy print sat beside a circle of painted rawhide 4 colors meeting at a center point that made the room feel truer than square. They worked without ceremony. A ranch hand with a split palm sat jaw-clenched while Jonah stitched loosely enough to give swelling room. Naya set a tea to steep on the stove leaf and water climbing toward each other with a dark smell. She brushed a cool wash along the man's wrist and spoke low. When Jonah tied off the last stitch, the man looked at his hand as if it belonged to him again. He left a package of cured meat on the step and did not wait for a thank you. At dusk, Abigail Holloway came with a wrapped plate and a small frame. She set the plate on the counter and hung the frame on a nail above the washstand. The daguerreotype showed Naya on her knees by the ditch, a boy's arm in her hands, rain in the air like a veil. In the picture, the crowd had blurred. The work did not. Abigail dusted her fingers on her apron and looked around the room with a satisfied eye. The clock in her kitchen ticked away miles, she said. This place counts different. She left before they could spend gratitude on her. In the afternoons, a little class gathered behind the clinic in the shade of a cottonwood. Jonah set a length of twine in the dirt and drew a knee joint. He showed how a tendon slid inside its sheath. He spoke with spare words and let touch do the rest. Naya held up a plant where the white root smelled like clean rain. She named it Osha to one set of ears and bare root to another. She passed the stem around and told them to listen with their noses. Star Mora sat cross-legged and added a story about storms and thresholds that made the plant more than a tool. Some days Maeva came and sat near the doorway, her hands busy, her eyes soft and sharp. She fixed a bead string that had snapped and hummed a lullaby that made Jesse look up and lean into her side. Ruth mended shirts and listened while she worked. Talon stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the space between people rather than the people. When Jonah caught his eye, Talon gave a short nod that was not an apology, and not a claim, simply a place they both could stand. Jonah forged after the last patient left. He melted the 2 silver dollars in a shallow crucible, the coins giving up their faces at a heat that brought a hiss to the air when he quenched the mold. He filed the edges until the circle felt right in the fingers. He pressed one side with a caduceus he had carved into a scrap of iron. The other he stamped with a spiral that Star had drawn on paper and held up to the window until the light made it live. When he lifted the pendant by a leather cord, it turned slowly and showed both truths without choosing one. Naya stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair tied back with a strip of red cloth. He stepped close and set the pendant in her palm. The silver was warm from the work. She looked at the marks and at him. He did not explain. She threaded the cord over her head and settled the weight against her collarbone. Her fingers found it and rested there for a breath that let the room change. Later, near full dark, Rowan Pike rode up the creek road on a bay that did not know how to hurry unless told. He wore a plain coat and carried his hat in his hand. Isaiah Boone walked out to the yard as if he had known the sound of that horse long ago. The badge on his vest was not the old one. Rowan had pinned a new star on Isaiah with steady hands 3 weeks back and written the letter that made the county nod. The paper had a careful script and a signature that did not try to excuse itself. Rowan dismounted and stood with the horse's reins over one arm. He waited until he was asked in. Jonah moved to the doorway and leaned his shoulder there. The clinic behind him breathed alcohol and sage. Naya stood at the back table watching. Rowan unfolded a packet from his coat. Inside lay 2 documents with stiff paper and the bite of fresh ink. He set them on the counter, a land patent with seals that glowed under lamplight, an order from the county that named Pine Gate an educational and cultural site with protection under law. The language was tidy and avoided the words most people used. Isaiah read the lines once and then read them again. He allowed himself a small breath and put the papers flat beneath a glass weight. Talon stepped in from the yard with Jesse at his side. Jesse stood straight, chin up, one eye the color of deep water, the other the warm brown of mesquite wood. Rowan looked at the boy with the caution of a man approaching a spring he cannot see the bottom of. Talon moved closer by an inch. Rowan stopped at that inch and held it. "Hello," Rowan said. "Hello," Jesse answered. Maeva came and put a hand to the back of the boy's head. She set a cup of sweet tea on the counter and passed it to Rowan without fuss. He drank and set the empty cup down. They stood in the small space between what they wanted and what time was willing to give. No one tried to fill that space with promises. Harkins did not ride through town that week. His bay had been seen cutting north with a new brand half burned in. No one went looking. Isaiah kept his hat low and his eyes open. He rode to Sangre Flats and back along the ridge up the wash through the cottonwoods until the shape of the valley settled under his skin. That evening, a woman from the line of wickiups came in pale and sweating, one hand pressed to her belly. Naya guided her to the bed while Jonah set a kettle on the stove. Star took the boy outside and showed him how to count the breaths of a cricket so he would not hear his mother's. Maeva set her palm to the woman's hair and talked about rivers until a tight knot loosened inside the body that had made a home for a life. When the child came, the room found its quiet. Jonah cut the cord with a clean blade. Naya wrapped the small wet weight and set it on the mother's chest. A cry rose thin and fierce. The clinic held it like a candle. Abigail arrived with quilts and a bowl of broth. She sat down hard in the wooden chair and let herself smile at the same time as everyone else. She had carried messages and flour and grief for too long to be surprised by joy. She touched the baby's foot with one finger and then got up and went home to keep the clock honest. Night settled over Pine Gate. The creek caught the moon and broke it into silver pieces that hurried downstream. The pendant on Naya's chest flashed and went dark and flashed again as she moved. Jonah hung the lantern on its nail by the door and breathed the cool outside air until it made his teeth ache. Isaiah leaned his chair back 2 inches and let it fall flat again. Rowan walked to the edge of the yard and looked toward the dark line of the hills where a man could ride and not come back for a long time. He turned and glanced toward the window where Jesse's face floated for a moment in the yellow light, then disappeared. Naya touched the bone amulet beneath the new silver and felt the calm it carried. She looked at Jonah. He met her eyes and nodded. They stood side by side on the clinic porch and watched the 2 fires along the creek, one at the encampment, one at the cabins. The flames held small and steady. The cottonwoods whispered. The creek did not tire. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.